They say blood is thicker than water, but in my family, blood was just a way to hide a knife behind their backs. 5 years ago, I stood at my father's funeral while my own brother and mother whispered in the corner. Before the soil even touched the casket, they had already forged the documents. They stole my inheritance, my childhood home, and my dignity. They laughed as they threw my bags on the sidewalk and told me I was no longer part of the family because I was broke. But karma has a beautiful way of coming full circle. While they were busy living a life of luxury with my father's hard-earned money, I was working 3 jobs and building a company they could never dream of. Yesterday, their bank finally foreclosed on that house. And guess who was the secret buyer at the auction? That's right, me. I am standing in front of my father's house right now, holding the deed. In exactly 24 hours, the people who betrayed me will be the ones standing on the sidewalk with their bags. This is not just a story of wealth, it's a story of ultimate justice. Sit down and listen closely, because you won't believe the look on their faces when I showed them the eviction notice. His lawyer leaned across the mahogany and said 5 words into Vincent's ear. Vincent's face went the color of bruised milk. I smiled like someone who had been waiting to see a pot finally boil over. I never thought my own mother, my mother-in-law, would betray me for a few dollars, but life has a funny way of turning. That sentence is the bait on the hook. The real story is how someone can live inside a marriage for 15 years and still find out, in one neat, humiliating moment, that everything you thought was mutual was actually an accounting error written in your husband's favor. If you like comeback stories, hit subscribe and stick around. There's a payoff coming, and it's the kind of slow, quiet thing that makes men who believe they're clever look very small. We were young when it started to feel like an adventure instead of a decision. He was 27, I was 24. He had ideas that smelled like money and confidence, and I had a job punching tabs at the county clerk's office and a shelf of books on running a business. He called me practical. I called him charming. We married because charm looked like a ladder and I wanted to climb it with someone I trusted. There are things nobody tells you about partnership until you're several years in. Nobody says the little labors add up like compound interest. Scheduling the dentist, calling the contractor back, listening to a quarterly loss, and deciding whether to say anything, boiling a pot of rice while a meeting on the speakerphone takes the tone of the evening. I became, in the most ordinary way, invisible in the places that matter. I handled the household finances even when Vincent told people he'd outsourced bookkeeping. I prepared the meals he liked for investor dinners. I memorized the business partners' children's names. I kept Tyler's school schedule on a paper calendar tacked near the back door. I thought of myself as an unpaid chief operating officer of our life together. He thought of me as a comfort and a sounding board in his public face's number 2. My grandmother's voice lived in the back of my head through those years like a hymn. She used to say, "A woman must have a purse and a plan." She'd scrambled her own way through war and widowhood and left me a recipe box and a stubborn caution. Never let your livelihood live entirely inside somebody else's zip code. I did not expect to need that recipe box as evidence, but I kept it anyway, and I kept other small things too. Statements, copies of checks, notes that proved I'd been paying the utilities when the payroll account bounced in the summer of optimism. 15 years have a curve of quiet moments that look like contentment until you put them side by side and see a different picture. There were nights when Vincent spoke about new ventures like a prophet, and I applauded because I had faith in him. There were mornings when I would sit at the kitchen table with my hand around a mug of coffee and balance the house books with a pencil that had chewed edges. We painted the kitchen sage green because he liked the color and it softened the morning light. I quit my paid job once he said, "We need someone in-house to keep things tight." The house grew quieter around me in ways that were never quite spoken of. So when he set the divorce papers down at the kitchen table like a spare menu and said almost casually, "You can have the house," the air in my mouth went thin. It was a Tuesday. He said he was tired. He said he wasn't happy. He said I could take care of Tyler. The cruelty was not in the offer but in the tone, a clerk reading options rather than a man ending a shared life. His mother, Lorraine, arrived like a stage prop. She has the kind of sympathy that fits in a handbag, measured, wrapped in charity, ready to be displayed. Lorraine had been present in our marriage for longer than I had. She had taught me how to fold napkins into fans for her open house fundraisers. She had baked pies on holidays and sent checking account advice through emails signed with a heart. I thought she was family. She is family, but family can carry gravel in its pockets. Lorraine's first act of betrayal was not dramatic. It was banal and efficient. She told me she'd help pack. Help, in her language, meant efficiency, the way dry hands mean thrift. She sorted my things into black garbage bags with surgical speed and an expression that read, "logistical necessity." When she zipped the bags, she didn't look at me. Brittany, the younger woman who'd been brought into the office under the guise of assistant, walked behind her carrying a box of champagne glasses that had my name on them from our 10th anniversary. Brittany smiled like someone who believed she'd been given a gift. Diane, the friend I thought was a confession booth when I needed someone neutral, became a conduit of information. Small betrayals had a way of stacking. A text passed along, a detail shared over coffee, a recollection of a conversation I'd had in private. Diane's voice when we spoke on the phone started to fray. She didn't say, "I'm sorry." She said things like, "You should know how it looks." She kept her apologies in the ivory jar of our friendship and only took them out when convenient. Tyler curled inward. He's 15 with an old man's moral clarity and a teenager's knack for being silent when the atmosphere smells like knives. He asked the adult questions in the way that made me think my grandmother's caution had been necessary. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't we move when the account started bouncing?" He looked at me like he was measuring me to see how much of his life I was keeping by force. I might have lost the house that day, I thought, but I wasn't going to lose my son or the small things that represented my autonomy. There's a practical second of decision where panic can be converted into strategy. I took it. I didn't confront him in the kitchen. I did not scream. I moved into a guest room with 2 suitcases and a method. I started at night, the way people who keep secrets do, quietly with lamps on low and a notebook open. 3 years earlier, this is important, something in the books had made me stop calling him my Vincent in my head and start calling him the accounts. I noticed small inconsistencies, a mortgage payment that seemed to have moved from the business account to a line of credit in a spouse's name, a vendor paid twice, a withdrawal that read crypto transfer for $64,000 that made no sense on the ledger. I thought I was protecting his reputation by not saying anything. I told myself marriage is about loyalty and that I was serving something larger than myself. Then I found the pattern. When you sit with pages of bank statements long enough, patterns emerge like shorelines. Multiple mortgages had been taken out on properties that had been promised to partners or investors as collateral. Lines of credit were maxed out and then shuffled between business entities. There were crypto accounts that lost more than $120,000 in speculative trades. There were betting slips, not with a bookmaker, but with online platforms that moved money like it was vapor. It looked like a house of mirrors someone had built to keep the truth blurry. I did not take anything that wasn't mine. I photocopied. I mailed documents to myself as PDFs and saved them with timestamps. I printed statements and tucked them in a cardboard box our house didn't miss until it mattered. I set up a meeting with Nina because strategy without counsel is hope wearing a mask. Nina is the kind of lawyer who speaks like a compass, unflashy, steady, and disconcertingly correct about numbers. She called things what they were and refused to let me be sentimental about the parts of the life that had been financial fantasy. "We're not here to win a morality show," she told me over coffee. "We're here to anticipate moves and close loopholes." Her first question was practical. "What can you prove?" My answer was small things that add up to large truths: bank statements, signed contracts, copies of checks, invoices in my name, emails where he authorizes payments. We talked about the simple and ugly arithmetic of divorce when assets are amiss. Who pays which debts? What counts as marital property? What can be protected as separate? She listened to my story and then helped me separate sentiment from necessity. "You need to preserve Tyler's future," she said. "You do that with legal tools, not speeches." So I did what my grandmother taught me in spirit and what Nina advised in practice. I moved my IRA and the inheritance my grandmother left me, money that had always been meant for Tyler, into an irrevocable trust. It was not theater, it was a legal firewall. The amounts were round and carefully documented. An IRA at the time of $80,000 and an inheritance of roughly $440,000 for a combined total of approximately $520,000. That trust was specifically for Tyler's education and care, and it was structured so it could not be drawn upon by marital creditors. If you're wondering whether it felt like betrayal to protect money from someone you've been married to, the answer is that betrayal is a word that changes with context. Protecting a child is not betrayal, it is precaution. I did not announce the trust to Vincent. You don't flash your safety net when the trapeze act goes wrong. I filed the documents and signed the escrow and the trustees and the dates, and breathed through a bureaucratic neatness that felt like prayer. I did it quietly because there was no point in adding a fight to a house already full of cold shoulders. Knowing was different from proving. Finding a pattern of debt is one thing. Making it legible in a court of law is another. Nina helped me make the ledger tell a story. In one column we placed the houses and what they were worth on paper. In the other column we placed the mortgages and what the liabilities actually were. We added lines for credit cards and for business loans that had been moved between shell companies. The totals were not pretty. The company that Vincent had advertised as a stable concern sat with liabilities that exceeded its supposed assets by more than $1 million, an ugly, honest number on the page. There is a temptation in narratives like this to make decisive, violent moves, explode the accounts, make accusations on social media, confront the father of your child in a recorded meltdown. But we operate in laws and contracts. Revenge that isn't lawful is vanity. I chose patience because men like Vincent mistake patience for weakness. Patience is a strategy when executed well. I let him take what he wanted, or at least I let him think he had taken it. In the months leading up to the mediation, he made his moves publicly. He redecorated parts of the house with the ease of someone who had been told they were entitled. He invited Brittany to family dinners with a grin like an announcement. He told investors that the divorce was a private matter and not one to affect operations. Harold, his lawyer, advised him to take the company assets as quickly as possible, to cut exposure. Harold's counsel came with a warning that sounded like flattery. Sign now, and you control the destiny of those pieces. Harold's voice was not unkind. It was professional in the way a surgeon is professional. You sign here, Harold said to Vincent in an early session. You take those properties. We draft the liability assumption. You'll be the one responsible for maintaining them. You'll have the upside. Harold wasn't wrong about the upside. He simply didn't read the same fine print we had inserted. That insertion was the liability disclosure addendum. It is a document that looks unromantic on the page, but works like a slow-acting agent. It states clearly, in plain language, that any party who accepts certain assets accepts associated debts, liens, mortgages, and contingent claims up to the totals listed. We drafted it in such a way that an asset could not be severed from its liabilities. When someone takes a property as is, they accept the mortgage, the back taxes, the pending contractor liens. That is normal in law. What was not normal was the scale of liabilities attached to the assets Vincent believed he was taking. We waited for him to sign with the sort of patience that is almost boring. He liked to move quickly when gain was on the table. Greed is a hurried thing. We scheduled mediation and then moved the conversation to the conference room where papers are signed and cups of coffee sit untouched. It was in that room, with a third of the town's legal community grinning politely over portfolios, that Vincent showed what arrogance looks like on paper. He announced, with an arrogance that sounded rehearsed, that he wanted everything, not figuratively. He said the words like a selection from a menu. I want the house, the cars, the business. I'll take it all. He said it without asking about the debts. That was his mistake. The one arrogance that comes from being used to people not reading. He believed his charm would cover the blanks. He believed his smile could unmake pages that had been signed. He believed that I would be the one humiliated at the end of things for daring to ask for fairness. Lorraine sat close by and nodded with the concentration of someone who had invested in her son's performance more than in her daughter-in-law's humanity. Brittany held a thin folder in her lap and looked only at me, the way someone looks at an animal that will be fed from them. Diane did not attend the meeting. Betrayals are quieter when they are tactically absent. Nina asked a question no one expected. Are you sure you want to sign the asset transfer without acknowledging the outstanding liabilities? Harold bristled at the insinuation. That's standard, he said. We don't list every vendor on an agreed transfer. You can negotiate later. That is the line people build their livelihoods on. Postpone, negotiate, ignore. It is a line of sand before a storm. Nina's counter was surgical. We will include a liability disclosure addendum. If your client signs to accept those assets, he accepts the debts listed. Harold smiled and said what lawyers say when they think the other side is bluffing. We'll sign. My client is not afraid of a piece of paper. I could have spoken. I did not. There is a performance that is more valuable than truth at certain moments. The performance of bewilderment, of being out of options, of being willing to walk away. I played the part with an exactness that tasted like copper in my mouth. When the day came for signature, Vincent moved with the cunning of someone who thinks the sauce will always be hot. He signed the transfer papers greedily, his pen moving as if it were placing a stake rather than weighing a burden. He waved at Brittany in a private language. Lorraine folded her hands with the serenity of someone who has rehearsed suffering on Sundays and profit on weekdays. 5 words from Harold to Vincent made the blood drop from Vincent's face like a slow leak. He heard something he had not anticipated. I sat still and watched the moment expand and hollow out. The room smelled of paper and stale coffee and the sort of precise, grinding disappointment that follows hubris. He read what we had set before him. The liability numbers did not add to profit. They subtracted in ways he had not imagined. Vincent had wanted everything except the one thing that belonged only to me, Tyler's welfare. He thought he could have the trophies of success and leave me the moral leftovers. He never learned that moral leftovers have weight when you place them on a balance with legal instruments. I did not gloat. Satisfaction is not the same as spectacle. I folded my hands and let silence do the work that accusations cannot. When he looked up, his eyes were an absence of words. He had taken a selection off a menu without asking the chef what was in the stew. At the end of that day, people walked out into the parking lot with faces they could not easily wash. Brittany kept her phone like an animal keeps its tail, present and vigilant. Lorraine smiled with the brittle courtesy of someone who has traded loyalty for a projected future. Diane sent me a text that read, I'm sorry for everything. It could have been sincere, But sincerity can also be a small token wrapped carefully around an avoidance. That night, Tyler and I sat on the porch and watched the neighbor's dog chase its tail with a kind of determination that felt like a lesson. He leaned his head against my shoulder and said, "You were right about that thing with the accounts." There was no triumph in his voice, only recognition. That was enough. We had built a plan. We had placed certain things beyond reach. We had the trust. We had the printed pages that made the liabilities plain. But a plan in the hands of a lawyer is different from a plan in a judge's chamber. I knew there were steps left. A mediation where the ink could still blink back like a living thing. A formal enforcement where the words we had written would be tested in public. I knew, too, that men like Vincent make mistakes born of hurry, and that hurry would be the thin thread we pull. There is a peculiar sort of loneliness in waiting. It is not a dramatic loneliness. It's a bookkeeping loneliness. It involves sitting with calculators and with Asians. Will the lender call a default? Will a contractor press a lien? Will an investor lose patience and pull the business into chapter proceedings? It is all in the probabilities, and probabilities are less passionate than revenge and far more useful. Nina's emails were pragmatic and had the tone of someone who could sleep with a ledger balanced. She scheduled our calls. She told me we were likely to see Harold attempt to reframe the addendum as sloppy drafting or to accuse us of trying to trap a grieving man. She predicted the theater because she has seen it before. "We don't need to make him small," she said. "We need to make him responsible." Responsibility is a strange weapon. It's not fireworks. It's not a scream. It's a demand that the world measure what it has promised. It is, in many respects, moral accounting. People asked me in those weeks how I could be so calm. I told them the truth. Patience had become my principle. They heard the word calm and read in it forgiveness. They were wrong. Calm was not surrender. Calm was the quiet in which you let the other person prance and then watch them step onto the ledger you've placed like a trapdoor. There were small triumphs that felt like breadcrumbs. I reclaimed the recipe box from the bag Lorraine had labeled decor. It smelled faintly of bay leaves and my grandmother's hand. I sat with Tyler and taught him to fold the napkins into fans the way Lorraine had shown earlier. We laughed because the fan always came out crooked, and because learning a little domestic ritual after a marriage looked like a tiny private resistance. But the storm hadn't moved off the horizon. Harold filed motions that were routine yet clumsy, and Vincent's investors began to ask questions, the way people with stock options ask about the smell of smoke. Brittany's name started to begin to lose its blush. She began to look like anyone who finds themselves in a spotlight they cannot control. Lorraine called occasionally and spoke in a voice meant to be patient. She asked about Tyler as if he were a damaged item to be pried from a shelf. There is a mechanical part of grief that comes with betrayal, the filling out of forms, the buying of boxes, the reallocation of phone numbers. There is an emotional part that feels like a bruise that will throb for years, and there is a strategic part that demands a ledger and a lawyer and a willingness to let the world measure what it owes. We prepared for the mediation with the calm concentration of surgeons before an operation. Nina told me to let Vincent speak. She told me to look unthreatening. She told me to let greed do the talking. I practiced in the mirror the look of someone who had been spent, but who had plans to be stitched back together. It is a particular expression, weary, slightly wilted, with the pupil small enough to read as hollow. It fools a certain kind of arrogance. On the morning we walked into the mediation room, I tucked the recipe box into the back of my car and left the guest room mattress in place for Tyler. We each carried our tiny private lights. I had, in a banker's envelope, copies of the trust documentation and the addendum printed in a font that could not be misread. The liability numbers were in bold. The combined outstanding liabilities attached to the properties totaled, roundly, $1,350,000. The business had creditors who together demanded more than it could service. and several contractors had filed preliminary liens. I did not say these numbers to shame. I said them as markers so that when the time came, a judge could count, and so could the bank. Harold had not expected us to be so particular with the wording. Arrogance assumes rough drafts and signed smiles. Those assumptions are dangerous in law because law rewards clarity. The mediation table has a peculiar geometry. People sit and imagine they are in the center of a compass. They speak of equity as if it were an emotion. They nod and brandish patience. In one corner sits the man who tried to have everything without reading the fine print. In another sits the woman who had quietly prepared for an eventuality he thought improbable. In the middle sits the page where signatures will be made and futures will be measured. We moved through the motions, offers, counters, small talk. A lawyer rehearses for when it needs to sound humane. Harold waved at us with the confidence of someone who thinks the truth is negotiable. Vincent smiled because he had convinced himself that he had earned the right to everything. Lorraine watched with the sort of interest one reserves for someone who believes the end justifies the means. And then we reached the manifestation of the plan. Nina placed the liability disclosure addendum on the table and said plainly, "If you accept these assets, you accept the liabilities up to the totals listed." Harold blinked like someone hearing an unfamiliar law. Vincent's pen hovered as if he were deciding whether to doodle in the margins of his life. You could see him making the calculation. Assets look shiny when you glance. Debts sit like stones until you pick them up. He thought the assets would be a net gain. He could not conceive of a world where property is a hook and a mortgage is the other side of it. When Harold whispered those 5 words into his ear, those same 5 words that made his color drain earlier, the moment tilted. It felt then like the world had leaned forward to look at the fake stage he'd spent years building. And in that lean, I felt a satisfaction so quiet it was almost reverent. I had not wanted spectacle. I had wanted justice as a kind of precise instrument, and justice, in our case, looked like a ledger that told the truth. We walked out of mediation with papers that smelled like defeat and possibility in equal measure. Vincent had taken his pen where his appetite had pointed, unaware of the way ink could be a chain as much as a key. The public will talk about greed. The private will whisper about whether the loss of money undoes the harm of betrayal. Tyler slept like a small animal that night, aware but unafraid, and he slept against me in a way that made me think the work would be worth it. I had not avenged myself. I had protected my child and preserved a future that could be rebuilt on steadier foundations. There were still steps. There would be filings, likely an audit, certainly a judge who would have to be persuaded that words mean what they say. Harold could still find a loophole. Vincent could still attempt to claim some kind of error or misrepresentation, or he could simply walk away and leave a litany of unpaid bills in his wake, forcing a messy public collapse. The narratives of downfall are always messy. I had arranged to let the mess be measured rather than merely sensationalized. That evening, alone in the kitchen that had been painted sage by hands that had once been gentle, I took the recipe box from the drawer and opened it. A card flopped out in my grandmother's hand. "Money is an instrument. Use it kindly." I laughed then, not the loud kind, but the small, private laugh that felt like a wink between generations. I knew there was a long road ahead. The best part of planning is that it leaves room for rebuilding. Outside the light was thin and the air smelled of late autumn. Tires crunched in the street. I sat at the table and wrote a list of what would matter when the dust settled. Tyler's school, the trust accounts, the small business idea I'd shelved for years, a color swatch for a kitchen that would be mine entirely. I folded the list and put it in the recipe box as if my grandmother were issuing counsel from her small paper grave. The day when Harold's whisper made Vincent pale was not the end. It was the hinge. Everything could still swing if the right hands pushed. I had prepared my hands to push in the other direction. It is strange how quiet power feels, like holding an umbrella in a rainstorm you were told would never come. It keeps you dry and leaves others to wonder how you could have been so lucky. The next morning, a neighbor I hardly knew knocked on my door with a casserole and asked if I needed anything. Her face had the small, puzzled sympathy of someone who glimpses a private life and tries to make it neat with a dish. I thanked her and took the casserole like a person who accepts practical kindness because it keeps the world from feeling too raw. I am not telling you this to boast. There is nothing glamorous about scanning bank statements at midnight or about sitting in fluorescent-lit legal offices while men rearrange the trophies of their lives. I am telling you because betrayal shapes people into particular creatures. Some of us curl and others reassemble. I chose to reassemble. But reassembly takes more than legal papers. It takes small acts, like teaching your son to fold napkins again, and refusing to let a mother-in-law's black garbage bags become a metaphor for what you will accept in life. It takes a lawyer who refuses to be romantic about fairness, and a grandmother who left you money and recipes, and a stubborn conviction that you could have both a purse and a plan. We were not finished. Harold had filed a caveat. There would be motions, and the investors would rearrange themselves like pieces on a board. There would be a hearing where a judge would be asked to look at ink and at intent and decide who is responsible for the bill. There would be fallout that would not be quick or neat. I made tea and watched Tyler grade his own homework at the kitchen table. He doodled a comic strip about a man who tried to take everything and got the receipt instead. He slid the paper across to me and said, "You'll like how it ends." I kissed the top of his head and said, "So will I." We lay plans. We packed boxes that did not need to hold my belongings this time, but would hold my footsteps into the future. I went to sleep that night with a list of tasks. Meet with Nina, confirm the trust paperwork, schedule a deposition if necessary. The list kept me honest. It kept me moving. There was, however, a last small thing that worried me, a loose end that felt like a coin in a couch. Diane had texted and then stopped. Lorraine had changed the tone of her emails to a civil distance that at once smelled like relief and calculation. Brittany had retreated from social media, as if someone had taught her to disappear quietly. The pattern of retreat often presages a different kind of danger. The quiet attempt to salvage reputation before the collapse becomes public. I told myself to be patient. The game was not about spectacle. It was about endurance and about legal muscles flexed at the right time. The man who had betrayed me had signed his name to a ledger where debts lived like patiently sleeping beasts. He would discover them in daylight. I do not know what people imagine when they hear a story that opens with a whisper that makes a man pale. They think of vindication like a clap of thunder. Real life rarely offers thunder. It offers a long measured rain, a slow uncovering, the kind of legal and emotional unspooling that requires patience more than fire. But even patience wants a moment to startlingly point to. I am holding that moment like a small photograph. It is the one in which someone's smugness meets the unglamorous mathematics of liability. And it will be, when it comes, an exact and quiet thing. A judgment not of vengeance, but of consequence. There are still pages to write. There are still signatures to be read in court, questions to be answered under oath, and a judge who will weigh what we engineered against what was signed. The public will have its opinions. I will have mine. Tyler will have his. I have my grandmother's recipe box and a trust for my son. Those are not grand weapons, but they are enough to change how the rest of the story goes. We left the mediation room with the world looking no different, and yet incapable of fitting inside the same frame it had the day before. People who believed in quick headlines would be disappointed. People who believe in careful work would watch the slow wheels turn and understand that some victories are not about spectacle, but about the stabilized future you build when others mistook your silence for surrender. That evening, when the house quieted and the neighbor's casserole sat in the fridge, I sat at the table and wrote a list of clients I would call once I had the breathing room. A small design consultancy I'd meant to start, an online course I had been too busy to finish, a meeting with Sandra, a woman I used to tutor in business basics, and who had always said she'd open a shop if she had the courage. I wanted to help her open it. I wanted to do something that reminded me there is life after being unmoored by someone you loved. The plan was modest. Take $50,000 or thereabouts and seed a small business pivot, enroll in a couple of design courses I'd postponed, and start taking clients. The numbers on the page felt like a map that might lead back to me. And yet, even as I made the list and arranged the modest arithmetic of restarting, a small, almost imperceptible worry lived in the corner of my mind. Would the legal system, which sometimes moves like a glacier wearing a tuxedo, move quickly enough to keep the wolves at bay? Would Harold find a clever twist that pulled the liabilities away from the assets? Would an investor panic and call the loans? Those are the kind of questions that make a person sleep with one eye half open. I poured myself another cup of tea and opened the recipe box. The last card in my grandmother's neat handwriting read, "Measure twice, cut once, keep your hand steady." It is not a violent instruction. It is a patient one. It seemed then like the best inheritance she could have given. I slept with the recipe card under my pillow. When I woke, the phone had 3 messages. One was from Nina confirming a court date. One was from a neighbor offering to mow the lawn. The last was from Diane, a message that said simply, "Meet me tomorrow. I need to explain." It was not an apology. Apologies at this stage are often convenient. It was an invitation to either closure or further complication. I set the phone down and walked into the kitchen where Tyler was already making toast. He looked up and smiled with a small, rueful grin. "You ever think about what comes after?" he asked. "All the time," I said. "But right now, we make sure what's ours stays ours." We had protected the trust. We had laid a document that tied assets to liabilities and watched the man who wanted everything sign as if paper were a prize. We had done the boring, necessary work. Now came the unrehearsed part, letting the law do what laws are for and watching people face the consequences of signatures. There's a cold comfort in legal consequences. It does not feel like revenge. It feels like cause and effect laid bare. If anyone wonders whether a mother can betray for money, the answer is complex. People betray for small comforts, for reputation, for an imagined future that they believe justifies a present cruelty. That doesn't make the pain lighter. It only makes the arithmetic clearer. Later, when the public gossip called it a collapse, they would frame it in words that hung like lanterns. For now, it lived in the subtle angles of our days. The way Tyler made his bed differently, the way Lorraine's calls came only at certain hours, the way Brittany's smile had become a studied thing. The world did not end, but a chapter closed and another uncertain one opened. I finished my tea, tucked the recipe box back in its nook, and turned the page on the list of things to do. The immediate future was a sequence of hearings and filings. The long future was a kitchen I might repaint a color of my choosing, and a small business that would begin with a client named Sandra and a brave, ragged ambition. The tilt was there now. The rest is how the world measures consequence. I felt ready in the way a person feels ready when she has kept receipts and calls a lawyer who refuses to romanticize fairness. I felt steady. And then, in the quiet space between tasks, my phone buzzed with a voicemail that made me stop mid-step. Harold's voice, calm, controlled, said, "We'll be at the hearing next Tuesday. Prepare yourself." It was not a threat. It was a promise of theater. I set the phone down and looked at Tyler. He looked up at me like someone who has seen the nails driven into a box and still believes in the possibility of opening it. "We'll be okay," I said. He nodded, but he did not say the word revenge. He said nothing. He knew at 15 that the world was more complicated than that. I walked over to the sink and rinsed a plate, listening to the steady heartbeat of the house. When Lorraine had packed my things, she had wrapped a single thing carefully. My grandmother's recipe clippings. Maybe she did it to be kind. Maybe she did it because she wanted the illusion of charity. The point is irrelevant now. I had the recipes, I had the trust, I had a lawyer who made the law into an instrument rather than a spectacle. The next scenes would be technical. Discovery, depositions, a judge's chamber. They would also be emotional. The moment when Tyler learns fully what had been carried behind the scenes. The time when Diane either tries to mend or steps away entirely. The eventual day when public scrutiny meets private signatures. For now, I closed the recipe box, tied the ribbon, and slid it back where my grandmother kept her sewing needles and the names of old recipes in neat, looping ink. Thursday morning arrived with a sun that felt like an indifferent witness. Courthouses smell of lemon polish and confidential fear. Tyler walked in beside me, his jacket too big, his shoulders suddenly more deliberate. He carried a notebook with doodles on the cover. His private running commentary on men who try to have everything and forget the math. I felt the weight of the recipe box at my hip like an amulet, and the weight of Nina's steady presence at my back like armor. We'd prepped for this beyond the mediation. There were depositions where men who had once called themselves investors wheezed under oath and admitted they hadn't read the footnotes. There were interrogatories with the bland cruelty of legal forms that ask you to state what you thought you owned. Harold tried to narrow the conversation to feelings. Was Vincent surprised? Was he misled? And Nina answered with numbers, bank statements, vendor invoices, contractor liens, timestamps on emails where Vincent authorized transfers. Law is unsentimental. It prefers to count. Judge Patricia Holden was not the kind of jurist who enjoyed theater. She had the look of someone who has seen many private catastrophes arrive on public schedules and reduce them to syllogisms. She called order, and the room's peripheral chatter folded into the thick air. Lorraine sat somewhere near the back, folding and unfolding her hands the way someone smooths a tablecloth when they hope a stain might disappear. Brittany, when she entered, looked like a person trying on a face for a role she had rehearsed poorly. She avoided looking at me the way a small animal avoids a predator with an honest face. Harold opened the hearing with a cadence meant to be comforting. He spoke about fair negotiations and how people make choices. He emphasized Vincent's intent to shoulder responsibility. He tried to make the narrative human. Nina answered by walking the judge through the ledger. She placed 2 charts on the table, one with assets as they had been presented publicly, the other a ledger of liabilities that had been quietly attached. "These aren't speculative," she said. "These are recorded liens, outstanding mortgages, unpaid contractor claims, and transfers between entities designed to obscure obligations. The addendum binds the assets to those debts." It is a strange thing to watch numbers speak in a courtroom, but speak they did. When a Lion clerk testifies and points to a recorded document, the room listens better than it listens to emotion. The creditor's statements were as ordinary as utility bills and as damning as confessions. Invoices for nearly $300,000 in unfinished renovations. A tax lien for back payroll. A business loan restructured twice and cross-collateralized against 3 properties. The crypto losses recorded as transfers out of business accounts into private wallets. The total numbers added up in a way that made the word solvent feel conditional and fragile. Harold tried a last theater. He suggested that the liability disclosure addendum was a trap, that it was drafted in a way an ordinary person could not reasonably accept. Nina's response was surgical and calm. Mr. Mercer signed a document that states in plain language that he accepts those liabilities if he takes the assets. He initialed the pages, indicating he read them. It isn't a trap. It's written in the language of agreement. She slid across copies of the signed pages. The ink was careful. The initials were deliberate. A signature is not a poem. It is an agreement. Then Harold did what he had hinted he might. He whispered to Vincent. The whisper was pitched to be private, but carried the weight of counsel that thought it could still change a man's mind. Vincent's face changed in a way I recognized from the mediation room. Pallor flooding the skin, the slow seeding of color as reality stepped into the place where charm had once stood. Judge Holden asked a question that could have been a punchline to a long-running joke in our household. Did Mr. Mercer understand the implications of what he signed? Harold's answer tried diplomacy. Vincent, called to the stand, tried to construe surprise into a defense. His words were small things. He had been busy. He had thought negotiations were routine. He had not understood the full scale. There is a particular kind of grief that lives in someone who has misread a contract and expects the world to rewrite itself to fit their ego. It is not dramatic. It is arithmetic, and the judge is better at arithmetic than at pity. Nina walked us through the plain language again. Assume the liabilities, she read from the addendum, including but not limited to mortgages, mechanic liens, outstanding vendor claims, tax obligations, and contingent debts as listed in Exhibit A. Exhibit A bore the numbers. The judge looked down. Vincent, who had been practiced in speech, had not been practiced in ledger reading. He was in that room with the paperwork before him, a man who had mistook painting for property and charm for title deeds. The judge's voice, when she rendered the decision, was not victorious. It was legal. She enforced the contractually elected division. The signed addendum she held was binding. The law recognizes written agreements, she said. A party who signs an agreement accepts its terms, including specified liabilities. The enforcement was not theatrical. It was precise. It was the law doing what the law does, turning signatures into consequence. For a moment, the world was reduced to the small sounds of papers being moved and a man breathing his realization. Vincent's jaw worked. His mouth tried to form a sentence. Lorraine pressed a hand to her throat, as if she'd been surprised by the acidity of her own decisions. Brittany's face turned a peculiar color. Skirts, like a costume that no longer fit. Diane did not come into court. She had sent a note that said she would not be present. That absence was a kind of presence, as telling as any testimony. Outside the courthouse, reporters circled for narrative. Inside, the decision meant the math was on record. Vincent had taken the assets. He had signed for the liabilities. The bank would call. The contractors would proceed. Investors would have to account for collateral. Consequence, unlike retribution, is an institutional thing. It is the world's way of saying names have weight. In the days after the hearing, the household unraveled in the slow, precise way of falling apart under bookkeeping. One by one, creditors called. The business's line of credit was frozen pending a covenant default. A contractor who had been waiting for payment placed a lien on one of the properties Vincent had accepted. An investor withdrew an offer of a bridge loan, citing unfavorable collateral. Brittany's phone stopped receiving the glossy messages of invitation. She packed a bag, the way someone leaves a stage after a night that has gone badly. She slipped out of town and changed her number. Lorraine's calls came more often at first. They sounded like excuses wrapped in concern. Later, her voice became transactional, small talk stitched into requests that were humbly phrased but burning with calculation. Diane did come to see me one afternoon. She sat on my couch with her knees turned inward, the posture of someone apologizing for a debt they don't know how to pay. Her eyes were wet but not entirely certain of the sincerity in their moisture. "I'm so sorry," she said. And then, as if that was loose change she had never been trained to spend, "I didn't mean to." She looked at Tyler as if seeking a verdict. Tyler, who had been 14 when the first cracks appeared, and 15 when the signatures were made, listened with the peculiar patience adolescents reserve for grown-up things they don't intend to fix themselves. He sat tall and said simply, "You made choices." There was no public forgiveness in his voice, but there was recognition of betrayal, of complicity, of the hard arithmetic of choices. Diane tried to explain that she had been scared and confused, that she had thought Vincent would protect things. "Protection," Tyler said, "doesn't look like passing notes." Diane left with a promise to do something modest and legal, return some documents she had in her possession, and to write a statement correcting things she had claimed. Her apology had the shape of someone attempting to repair a hole with thread rather than a seamstress's cloth. It was something. It was not everything. People make choices. They also get to confuse their conscience after the fact. That will not change the ledgers. Vincent's company went into a slow choke. Employees began to mention uncertainty in the kind of emails that suggest layoffs. An important client postponed a contract. A lender called a default. Another conversation turned into a negotiation about whether to foreclose or restructure. The particulars of financial collapse are boring and awful. Phone calls at 2 a.m, nervous legal letters, the version of panic that smells like paper and worn shoes. Lorraine called less often. When she did, her voice floated on the phone like someone trying to find the right note to sing a regret. She asked after Tyler in the way one asks after a plant one once watered in passing. "How is he doing? Has he eaten?" It is not my place to be a furnace for other people's guilt. I told her what was true. Tyler was fine. He was sleeping. He was doing his homework. That was the social answer. The private answer was the ledger she had helped place in Vincent's slow descent. There is sometimes an image people want at this stage, as if betrayal and its consequences must end with a tableau, a confrontation, a confession, an estranged hug at a funeral. Life rarely organizes itself into such frames. Instead, it becomes the small business of cleanup. Emails to attorneys, calls to banks, forms to be returned. The court judgment existed as a turnstile. The next days were a procession through it. I did, however, give myself one small mercy. I took the $50,000 I had earmarked and began the work of being what I had always been, a person with a taste for arranging things. I enrolled in the design courses I had postponed for a decade. I called Sandra, who had a dream of a tiny shop that sold candles and second-hand tableware. "I'll help you," I told her. She cried on the phone, which felt like a small and honest victory. We redid a floor plan on a Tuesday at noon between hearings. We talked about paint color as if color were a kind of geography, and about window displays as if they could be flags for a new life. Starting again with money that was modest and sensible felt like a restoration of order. The trust remained intact for Tyler. The irrevocable nature of it meant that what was meant for him would remain. I never touched that principle. That was the line I had promised myself and my grandmother's recipe box I would not cross. The rest, $50,000 and a small optimism, became a seed. Sandra's shop opened 6 months after the hearing. She named it for her grandmother's kitchen table. The first client I took as a paid consultant was a woman who wanted a bedroom that felt like a sanctuary rather than a showplace. We agreed on muted colors and practical shelving. The first weekend I had earnings that felt like the sound of a small drawer opening. It's not victory. It's bookkeeping that goes in the other direction. Vincent's unraveling was neither dramatic nor surreal. It was the small withdrawal of the scaffolding that had allowed him to perform. Investors restructured and wrote off some money. A creditor filed for foreclosure on a property that had been held as collateral. He moved with the economy of someone whose options had been measured and found wanting. There were articles that said "fall from grace," which is a sentence reporters use when they have to sell humility as entertainment. That language did not matter. The practical consequences did. Brittany did not contact me. Lorraine left me a voicemail with the formalities of family concern and nothing else. Diane sent a follow-up message that said she had returned certain documents and wanted to meet, but I was not sure I wanted to sit with someone who had handed my life over to convenience and then expected to stitch it back with words. Repair demands labor disproportionate to apologies. Tyler, who watches these things like a person learning how to hold future hurts without letting them ruin present joys, began to rebuild his own small architecture. He returned to his doodles and his small classroom victories. He made a friend who liked comics and borrowed design magazines I had brought home. He started helping me with client mood boards. On slow afternoons, we would make coffee and sit at the table and fold napkins into fans and laugh because the fan was crooked. Those crooked fans felt like a private triumph. There was a hearing later where an auditor went through the books and asked the mundane questions. Those sessions were procedural, the world insisting that lists be accurate and that obligations be tallied. Harold tried in the hearing to argue that there had been misrepresentation. Nina, steady as ever, pointed to paper after paper. The judge, who had seen enough to be unimpressed by theatrics, again favored precedent and clarity. The signed addendum the judge ruled was binding. Vincent's face during that hearing was a ledger of regret. He sat thinner, less practiced at being large. That was more telling than any speech. The business folded in parts. Some partners cut their losses quietly. People who had once sat at his table now avoided eye contact in the grocery store. It is small cruelty how quickly social capital drains when financial capital fails. I do not take pleasure in watching a person of my past stumble. The satisfaction I feel is quieter. It is the knowledge that I protected a child and that I did not let silence be mistaken for surrender. There are nights I still wake to a calculation and make a note. Call Nina, confirm trustee, check school enrollment. Those are the practical rituals of rebuilding. Lorraine did show up one day at the front path. She stood on the porch as if something in her had been rehearsed and then overturned. She spoke to Tyler first, awkwardly, and then to me. Her words were rehearsed and low. They wanted to be a mixture of remorse and pragmatism. She tried to explain that she had been scared for her son, that fear had made her choose what looked like security. Security, I said, as gently as I could, is not permission to trade away someone else's life. She listened. I do not know if she understood, but her hands trembled as she left. People keep saying the story is about betrayal for money. That is true, but it is also smaller and broader. People betray for comfort, for reputation, for the illusion of avoiding risk. They betray because sometimes the script of family seems to permit small cruelties that later crystallize into a ledger of consequences. Money is an instrument, my grandmother's words, and instruments can be used kindly or cruelly. Months later, when a friend asked how I kept my temper, I said it was not temper so much as work and patience. The plan had been a form of care. I could have chosen drama. Instead, I engineered the kind of slow legal machinery that turns signatures into consequence. I do not call that revenge. I call it accountability. There were small victories. A builder returned a set of plates that had been promised as collateral and apologized to Sandra when she came to collect a canceled repair. A bank offered me a small business line to explore the design consultancy I was launching, and I accepted. My income was modest at first, and better than the arrested hope of being invisible. Tyler got a scholarship interview that I had not expected him to get. He did well because he had learned to sit with discomfort and still work. He hugged me one night and said, "I'm proud of you." That line can be more potent than headline justice because it is private and solid. I do not want to make the story into a vanity piece. There were days I cried, and there were nights I sat with the recipe box, and let the scent of bay leaves remind me of people who had been stubborn in ways that protected their grandchildren. I still miss what was lost, the ordinary companionship, the imagined future we had once discussed over coffee. Loss has a prismatic effect. It refracts into different shades that do not go away, but they do change. Diane and I never found a way to be what we had been. She sent birthday messages for Tyler that read strangely formal. Sometimes people are not meant to be part of the repair process. Their role in a story is the one they played. She played the conduit. She offered an apology. I accepted what she gave, and no more. People are allowed their own moral economics. In the end, the legal instruments did their job. The trust remained for Tyler. The liabilities remained attached to the assets Vincent took. Creditors pursued their rightful claims. He had chosen to read only the menu and not the bill. The judge treated signatures as promises. That is all. That is enough. A year later, I sat at a kitchen I had repainted in a color I'd chosen. The sage green softened with a touch warmer, a hue I selected because it felt like a sunrise rather than a concession. Tyler and I arranged mugs on the shelf as if life was still domestic art. We had new clients, new tiny earnings, and the steady knowledge that we had weathered what most of our friends had called a catastrophe. We had weathered it with dignity, not because the world had been kind, but because we were meticulous. Once, when I was updating my ledger of small victories, I ran my finger along the edge of a card in my grandmother's recipe box. It read, "Again? Measure twice. Cut once. Keep your hands steady." The wisdom is humble. It is about carefulness and patience. It is not a battle plan. It is nonetheless a map. People will tell you the moral of a story like this should be righteous anger or vindictive victory. That would be a lie by omission. The moral for me is steadiness. It is the work of protecting what you can and being clear-eyed about what you cannot change. It is choosing to teach a son how to fold a napkin rather than spend nights substantiating a meltdown. It is choosing legal strategy over spectacle. It is closing the recipe box and letting the smell of bay leaves be a small sovereign comfort. When I look back at the kitchen table, where the divorce papers first landed like a casual menu, I do not feel the impulse to shout. I feel like a person who learned to read a ledger. I see where the cracks were and how they were filled. I see Tyler, who learned early that family is not only about who shows up at holiday dinners, but about who does the boring work that keeps futures intact. I see Lorraine, who made a choice she now must live with. I see Diane, who learned that being a confidant does not give one license to be careless with another's life. And I think of the title of the sentence that lured you into this story. I never thought my own mother, my mother-in-law, would betray me for a few dollars. But life has a funny way of turning. The truth is smaller and more complicated. Betrayal is rarely about a few dollars. It's about a constellation of small acts that together have the gravity of consequence. It's about a willingness to trade someone's future for a sense of security, and about the patience required to counter that with tools that cannot be erased by charm. If there is one thing I would tell anyone walking a similar path, it is this: keep the receipts and the recipe card. Keep the small legal defenses that protect what matters. Be patient and precise. And do not confuse quiet with surrender. Sometimes silence is a ledger waiting to be opened at the right time. I am starting a business that makes rooms feel like possibilities, and I teach Tyler how to make a perfect crooked napkin fan. He is doing fine. I am doing fine. Lorraine has learned the shape of consequence. Vincent lives somewhere in the arithmetic he misread. Diane has chosen a quieter life. If this story resonates with you, if you find something in these small betrayals and quieter victories that reflects your own life, there are more of my stories on the channel. Click one of the videos on your screen to keep listening. I have a drawer full of recipe cards and a head full of plans, and I'll tell you how the next one goes.